afternoon, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to EU-ISIS talk today. This is the first time, as a director of ISIS, I replaced Dr. Titinan as a director of ISIS this year. Thank you. Thank you very much. So hopefully we're going to have more cooperation with our stakeholders and partners, the year to come. But today, let me first say Happy New Year to all of you. It's still in spirit of New Year because the Lunar New Year is coming this weekend, so it's still celebratory mood. So today, we're going to talk about the EU-ASEAN cooperation. But before we start the conversations today, let me first introduce Dr. Pakorn Siripakor, the Associate Professor and the Dean of Faculty of Political Science, Chulalongkorn University. He's going to give a welcome remarks. Please, Ajahn.
Good afternoon, everyone. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Distinguished guests and members of the audience, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first public forum of ISIS Thailand in 2023. Today, we will be discussing the relationship between the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, and the European Union, or EU, in the context of changing geopolitics, both in Europe and in Asia. As we are all aware, the EU has recently faced a critical challenge to its long period of peace and stability since the end of the Second World War. Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which escalated into a full-scale war, has had worldwide repercussions and threatened the rule-based international order that has served as a cornerstone of global peace and prosperity for decades. This has prompted the EU to recalibrate its strategy to grapple with this new security threat and its socio-economic ramification. Furthermore, prior to Russia's aggressions, the EU had already begun to navigate a new geopolitical reality in which the United States and China are locked in an open competition for power and influence. Not only the Asia, but on a global scale. In this context, the strategic gap between Europe and Asia has been even narrowed. Both continents share common interests in maintaining global order and promoting peace and prosperity. Therefore, deeper cooperation between the two regions is even more necessary. This worth noting that ASEAN and the EU have had long-standing ties since 1977. In 2020, both parties elevated their relations to a strategic partnership, which is a milestone that demonstrates mutual trust and the desire for further engagement. In 2021, the EU formulated and adopted its strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, which was well received by ASEAN member states. However, many observers were critical of the EU's long-term commitment to the region, especially as the war between Russia and Ukraine may have shifted the EU's interests away from the region. Therefore, the EU's commitment to the region is crucial, and its Indo-Pacific strategy needs to be reaffirmed. Progress is being made as the EU-ASEAN Commemorative Summit was held in Brussels last month. This event is significant for both ASEAN and the EU in the long term. I believe that through deepening ties, both regions and the potential to make a significant impact on the geopolitical and economic environment. Therefore, it is very timely that the ISIS Forum today we'll discuss the new phase of EU-ASEAN relations. We are honored to have His Excellency Mr. Igor Dresmans, the EU Ambassador to ASEAN, with us today. We look forward to hearing from him about the EU commitment to this region and what ASEAN and the EU can work together on in the future. Before I end my remark, let me thank our speakers. Certainly, His Excellency Dresman, Ms. Usana Piranon, Dr. Nathanan Kunama, and Dr. Pinitpan Boripat. for sharing their time and expertise with us today. And also our moderator, our newly appointed ISIS Director, Dr. Pongpisut Butsabarat. I hope all of you will enjoy the ensuing discussion. Thank you very much for coming today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pakon. Dr. Pakon also newly appointed as a Dean of Political Science last year in September, so we are all new. So, but he's committed to ISIS work, and hopefully he's going to continue his support, and I'm very lucky to have him here. Thank you very much, Dr. Pakon.
This is my first time at ISIS.
Thank you. Yes, so next, this event won't be possible without the EU missions in Thailand support. So I'm honored today to have His Excellency Mr. David Daly, the EU Ambassador to Thailand, with us and for the whole time. And to give, please, Mr. Daly, please give opening remarks to the event.
Excellencies, Your Excellency, the Dean, Dr. Pakon, professors, distinguished academics, distinguished guests. Firstly, I would like to start with congratulations. Congratulations to Dr. Pongpisut Kunpol, taking over from Professor Titunen as the head of this institute. This institute being a foremost institute on foreign policy of the Kingdom of Thailand. So we wish you well in your new task, and we look forward to continuing our excellent cooperation together. Congratulations also to Dr. Prakron, 1 month as the new Dean, and we are honored that you are spending this time with us today. I want to welcome everybody to this series of seminars on EU policy and the Indo-Pacific region. It is something we are very happy to do in conjunction with Chulalongkorn University and the ISIS Institute. Some of you may recall that in September we launched this with a seminar on Myanmar. Today we have the second such seminar on EU-ASEAN relations. Last year we celebrated 45 years of diplomatic relations, and of course its wider implications. I hope that on a future occasion, maybe even the next one, we can have one specifically devoted to the EU Indo-Pacific strategy, which can go into more detail. So we're working on that as a delegation also with our colleagues in Brussels. Of course, we are delighted to have His Excellency Ambassador Igor Driesmans here with us. Ambassador Driesmans has vast experience. He's worked on Southeast Asia relations in the headquarters in Brussels. He has worked in the cabinet, in the inner office of the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, Madame Mogherini, where he was responsible for Asia. He has been for now a number of years the EU ambassador to ASEAN, based in Jakarta. And he is also the EU Special Envoy in relation to Myanmar. A man of vast experience. Igor is a man who, like others, remembers the relationship between the EU, Thailand, and ASEAN. He will recall the key and constructive role which Thailand has played in the context of EU-ASEAN relations, especially, but not only, but especially when Thailand held the post of being coordinator on the ASEAN side for ASEAN relations with the European Union. This was in the period 2016-2019. This strong and constructive cooperation between EU and ASEAN was very much influenced by the strong cooperation with Thailand, and we do not forget this. We had originally planned to have organized this seminar last November, but we weren't able to because of the major development which people were working on, which of course was the first ever summit between the EU and ASEAN leaders. The commemorative summit was held in the middle of December in Brussels, and Ambassador Driesman was at the inner core center of the preparation of that summit. So we felt there was better value in postponing the summit to have such a man with us here today, even though we had hoped we would have had it before the end of the year. But I think that that was very much the right choice. There is much to discuss. There's the EU and ASEAN, both being regional groupings, both believing very much in multilateralism. We have the EU-ASEAN Strategic Partnership, which was launched just over 2 years ago. We have many new future perspectives. We have the implementation of the Comprehensive Air Transport Agreement, which will bring more and cheaper air connectivity between the ASEAN region and Europe. We have our plan of action for 2023 to 2027, which was endorsed by the summit in December. And we have a whole series of work ongoing under the context of global gateway investments, some of which we very much hope will impact on ASEAN countries. So now I have a suggestion, and the suggestion is very simple and very obvious. Let us now listen to Ambassador Driesman, to Director General Kun Osana, and the other panelists. You've heard enough from me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Dali, for your remarks. So, Ambassador Dali is such an exemplar of the EU's commitment to Thailand, our friendship. So, EU in Thailand team is very generous to us and supporting our activities since last year, as he mentioned earlier. And actually, we are having more discussions sponsored by the EU this year for I think another 4 times to come. So please stay tuned on our website. So thank you very much, Ambassador Dali. So before we proceed to the talk, let me introduce our speakers. The first one, actually, Ambassador Dali has introduced Ambassador Drisman for quite a lot. So we are very lucky to have him here. Right, Ambassador Igor Drisman's the EU Ambassador to ASEAN and the European Special Envoy for Myanmar. We are honored to have him here, and he's able to squeeze his tight schedule during his trip in Thailand. So very appreciate his time. So I think we will learn a lot from him, as Ambassador Dali was mentioning, about EU perspective, and especially in the aftermath of the commemorative summit in Brussels last year. So the second one, we have with us Director General Usana Piranon, the Director General of ASEAN Affairs, Department of ASEAN Affairs, from the Thai Ministry, Foreign Ministry. So she's a well-rounded diplomat who have a wider experience in Thai foreign affairs, from ranging from South Asia, Middle East, African. That's her past post. So, but she has been involved with ASEAN quite extensively, and she's like a very good resource person in ASEAN and Thailand. So we are also lucky to have her here as well. So another two speakers on this panel are academics. We just have to balance between policymakers, practitioners, and academic point of view on these kind of issues. So we have another two academics from both Chulalongkorn University and Thammasat University. To my right, Associate Professor Dr. Tatanan Kunamat. Dr. Natanan is outstanding Europe scholars in Thailand who is dedicated, her research and teaching about Europe for decades, and now she was awarded Jean Monnet Chair and was ranked as a Knight of the Orders of Academic Palm by the French Ministry of National Education for the teaching service of French and European studies in Thailand. So we'll have a lot to learn from her perspectives about the EU and its strategy in Indo-Pacific. Last, Associate Professor Dr. Pinitpan Boripat. Dr. Pinitpan is currently the head of International Affairs Department, Thammasat University. Ajahn Pinitpan is also another recognized scholar in Thailand who is involved in research and teaching on Southeast Asia, both domestic and international politics, democratizations and conflict preventions. So one of his specializations actually about Myanmar politics, and I'm sure a lot of you will have Myanmar issue coming up during the discussion. So our format today, we are gonna have this order. We'll start with the Ambassador Drisman, followed by Dr. Natanan and Director General Usana, and then last speaker is going to be Ajahn Pinitpan. So without further ado, let me start our discussion. So let me start with Ambassador Drisman. Mr. Ambassador, the EU and ASEAN just commemorated the 45 years of the relationships, celebrated in Brussels last month on 14 December 2022. So it signifies some, like a lot of implications on this in this meeting, right? The two regional groups have become more integrated and share common interests, especially within the changing geopolitical environment. So many of us have a lot of questions, how the EU look at ASEAN, why ASEAN is important to the EU, and what's actually the outcome, that the EU and ASEAN are looking forward to implement and materialize in the near future. So lay observer may be critical of this kind of political fanfare. The leaders come and talk and then have the agreement and then nothing's afterwards. But what's the tangible outcome that both parties are looking forward to materialize in the near future? Please.
Well, thank you very much for having me here today. Thank you very much for organizing this wonderful seminar. Thank you for the kind words, David. I'm delighted to be here, as you said, just a few weeks after the EU-ASEAN commemorative summit, so it couldn't have been better timed. And I hope that we can also generate new ideas as we build on the what I would qualify the success of the EU-ASEAN Commemorative Summit. Now, before answering your question, maybe just a few facts about EU-ASEAN. 2 years ago, a famous professor, Singaporean national Tommy Koh, wrote a book about EU-ASEAN, and its title was The Untold Story. And the title reflects the feeling that we do so much good things, but nobody knows about it. So just for the sake of it, a few facts and figures about EU-ASEAN. First of all, we have 20 dedicated technical dialogues on high-speed computing, on science and research, on road transport, on human rights, on maritime security, you name it. So one could actually say that the EU is ASEAN's most comprehensive partner, even though that has now a political meaning which is a bit detached from the actual wording. Secondly, we remain ASEAN's largest development partner. We have an envelope of some 250 million euro and very substantial programs in support of ASEAN community building, ASEAN integration, from higher education to trade facilitation. Thirdly, we are still very important economic partners. We are each other's third largest trading partner. 1/4 of the FDI stock in ASEAN is European, and so on and so forth. So I thought I'd just put that out there. I think what we've been missing over the last couple of years is, while all of that was ongoing, was that political dimension. A bit of fanfare. The political dimension whereby leaders meet and exchange at their level directly. And that's exactly what happened when we met mid-December in Brussels, and I'm happy to report that it was successful, not just in terms of attendance, which is important, and not just in terms of atmospherics, which is also important, but also in terms of outcome. And I think there are 16 pages of very detailed recommendations to go forward. So if I look at the homework building on the summit, I'd maybe mention four areas. First, we need to continue to strengthen the economic and connectivity ties between the EU and ASEAN. I mentioned the figures, third largest investor and trading partner, etc. We also see that ASEAN continues to experience very solid growth, even in this difficult international environment, post-COVID, with the Russian aggression in Ukraine, etc., with a rapidly emerging middle class, still expected to more than double in size by 2030. So there's a lot to build on when it comes to the strengthening of trade relations. Now, we've also seen how fragile sometimes that economic progress is. We've all seen the fragility of the supply chains, notably in the wake of both the COVID pandemic and the Russian aggression. So that's why we need to double down on that economic and connectivity agenda, and that's exactly what we've decided to do. Ambassador Daly mentioned the Comprehensive Air Transport Agreement. It's a very big deal. We've negotiated it for 6 very long years, but the result is worth noting. It's the biggest agreement of its kind ever negotiated by the EU, and it will, we think, play an important role in reconnecting our two regions, creating not just new opportunities for the aviation sector, but also enabling further people-to-people ties. We will also continue investing. Global Gateway was mentioned. We have announced a figure of 10 billion euro in investments in Southeast Asia in the next 7 years. I'm also happy to report that the European Investment Bank has recently opened an office in Jakarta covering the entire region and is now, I think, progressing very well in identifying concrete projects in support of that agenda. I should also mention in this context that we want to double down on our free trade agenda. Where you know about the agreements that's been concluded and entered into force with Singapore and Vietnam. We're doing additional efforts to advance our negotiations with Indonesia, but at the same time, we remain open for the resumption of the negotiations with the other ASEAN countries, including, of course, Thailand. So we need to double down on that agenda as well. So that, I would say, that's the first piece of homework. Secondly, we've decided at the summit to develop a more ambitious green agenda. It's a priority, I'm sure you know, for the European Union after we have adopted the Green Deal for a circular carbon neutral economy by 2050. And we see ASEAN as an indispensable partner in that green transition. Because due to rapid growth, of course, ASEAN is increasingly a CO2 emitter, and if there's not a significant decarbonization of the economy, we will see in ASEAN an almost doubling of greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. So that green transition is extremely important, and the partnership that we are building in that respect is very important indeed. And we'll do so through different means, through cooperation projects. A lot of them are already ongoing, but we will double down on that with a Team Europe initiative, with further technical dialogues. I think about circular economy. We've set up a circular economy platform, including with the center based here in Bangkok, with a senior officials high-level dialogue. And we've decided to also, this year for the first time, have a ministerial meeting on environment and climate change. So a very ambitious agenda. I might add, we've also decided to launch an energy dialogue so that our experts can meet and discuss a lot of these issues. I will add to that we've concluded a just energy partnership with 2 ASEAN countries, Indonesia and Vietnam. So that's the second piece of homework. The third one is sometimes less talked about, but it's the need to build a security partnership. We all know that regional stability is increasingly challenged. We all see the big power competition and the potential for increasing tension. We all see the rise of the share of military expenditure also in this part of the world. So we are determined to deepen our security engagement with Asia, but I'd say specifically also with Southeast Asia. We have since a couple of years military liaison in our office in Jakarta, counterterrorism expert as well. And I think with that kind of expertise, we're able to take a step further when it comes to the security partnership. We will continue to seek to become observer in the ASEAN Defense Minister Meeting Plus format. Unfortunately, that's not something that has materialized yet, but we're hopeful that that will happen at some point soon. And then the fourth point and the last one is about the Indo-Pacific, and it was mentioned in the introduction, and it was very much part of the discussions at the summit and in the negotiations for the statement. I think we have respective strategies, the European strategy for the Indo-Pacific, the ASEAN outlook for the Indo-Pacific. There's a lot that both have in common, both are inclusive, both mention the importance of ASEAN centrality. Even if you look at the themes that are mentioned, there's a big overlap. And when I hear the priorities of the new chair, the new ASEAN chair, Indonesia, again, it dovetails with our Indo-Pacific strategy. So again, that's a fourth piece of big follow-up that we're keen to do. So I think all in all, we firmly believe in a strong ASEAN, because we think a strong ASEAN is in the interest of the European Union, because ASEAN at the center of this regional architecture can help to ease tensions, can provide further stability and prosperity for the region, and a strong ASEAN is also a like-minded partner for multilateralism. So I think both regions working together, we should be able to be these anchors for stability, for multilateralism, for free and fair trade. And I think that's the bigger message that we'd wanted to send at the summit in December. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very obvious that 45 years of ties between ASEAN and the EU has proven that we have growing interest, common interest among each other, and despite all the differences two regional groupings might have. And actually, this kind of optimism of the bilateral ties between the two groupings could reflect in, if I may recall, all of you, if you have seen the survey last year done by the Singapore-based ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute, it shows that 50% of the respondents have confidence on the EU. I mean, surpassing all of the ASEAN partners, and that shows a lot of things. They are confident that the EU will do the right thing, and I think this is reflecting what the EU and ASEAN has been trying to do together in the past couple of decades. So, and another, the same survey, another questions that might link to the Indo-Pacific strategies is that 40% of the respondents thinks that EU should be ASEAN's strategic choice in the power competition between great powers in the regions. So why EU, right? I mean, of course, geographically, EU is very far from ASEAN regions, and instead of Japan, of course, Japan, Australia, South Korea are among top strategic choices of the respondents, but EU become the first, and that's very interesting, and that reflects our geopolitical common interest in this changing environment. And having said that, we'll talk about the Indo-Pacific and EU place in ASEAN Indo-Pacific and ASEAN and EU Indo-Pacific strategies. So I'll pass this issue to Ajahn Nathanan to elaborate and to explain why EU is becoming ASEAN choice and vice versa. Please.
Okay. Distinguished guests, good afternoon, and thank you, Ajahn Pongpisut, our newly appointed ISIS Director, for introduction. After listening to Ambassador Driesman, the importance of these 45 years of ASEAN-EU relationship, I can relate considerably to my part in the broader Indo-Pacific region. I have seen two overlapping geopolitical spheres here. The first one is a regionalism to regionalism. The one is the EU and the other one is ASEAN. That Ambassador mentioned how important these 45-year relations has been through. I think we have, if I'm not wrong, have 6 partnership and cooperation agreements signed with EU Thailand, just recently signed the PCA, and then 2 FTA, as Ambassador mentioned, with Singapore and Vietnam. Of course, as Ajahn Pongpisu just raised, ASEAN is increasingly important in this partnership. I would like to add more, after listening to Ambassador Driesman, that there were the factors of upgrading these ASEAN and EU relations in recent decades. And these EU-ASEAN relations, I would point out in 2007, when the EU initiated the Nuremberg Declaration on Enhanced Partnership between EU and ASEAN, and that was the same year that we have ASEAN Charter in 2007, and through this, both sides and also the EU developed the European External Action Service and have actual kind of the foreign policy unit, which strengthened these ASEAN-EU relations. And the factors that I would put it as like a kind of technical word is the ASEAN Plus and ASEAN Minus, which upgraded this relation. Starting with ASEAN Minus, EU had to grow to accommodate changing global dynamics, especially trade. And what is ASEAN Minus logic is that how the EU engaged these ASEAN states individually, like in the case of EU-Singapore FTA and EU-Vietnam FTA. And then the next one, the ASEAN Plus logic. The ASEAN Plus logic, you've seen that in recent years, EU has committed a lot to ASEAN-led East Asian institutional architecture. It shows that EU show a tacit approval of ASEAN norms, which is very special. Like other external partners, you know that in this ASEAN centrality, ASEAN-driven East Asian regionalism, ASEAN be able to dictate agenda. And EU involved in ASEAN Regional Forum, the Security Matters Meeting, the East Asian Summit, the ADMM Plus, like ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting Plus. So in the bracket, at ASEAN invitation. So that's why ASEAN was so important in this partnership. And then coming to the Indo-Pacific part. In the Indo-Pacific part is another geopolitical sphere that I term it as regionalism to regionalization. One is the EU and the other is Indo-Pacific region, in which ASEAN is centrally located. The reason that I term Indo-Pacific region as regionalization, because this area is highly constructed, elite constructed, politically constructed, economically constructed. It did not correspond to material geography at all. So you see that 2 oceans, Indian and Pacific, and 6 maritime spheres. Why this Indo-Pacific, this new geographical area was so important? Firstly, in terms of economic weight so huge, covering over 60% of world GDP, and automatically is EU #1 trade partners in this regard. It covers major waterways, Malacca Straits, South China Sea, Taiwan Straits. You heard this maritime sphere, you see both opportunity and challenges, right? And then we elaborate later. You see that in Taiwan Strait, in particular, is the area that the world's chips and semiconductors was go a long way, right? In that route, and also like Ambassador Driesman just say, it's the largest middle class grown up area from the statistic. And then the second one, in terms of political weight, is the areas of flashpoint, right? Starting with Taiwan Straits again, what happened recently? There's a confrontation between US, China, and Taiwan. And we are in the middle of Russian and Ukraine war, and Russians' illegal annexation of 4 Ukrainian provinces also scare Taiwan that the mainland China might want to annex them as well. So it's a kind of tension in this area. And then South China Sea. The South China Sea is important natural resources and trade routes, and it's an area of border disputes between ASEAN states and China. And you know that ASEAN states is not that unified like EU member states. So the way that ASEAN states hedge bandwagon with China act differently, right? And that's why ASEAN sometimes failed to deliver one voice. Sometimes ASEAN break their consensus to deliver one voice on condemning China in the South China Sea issue. And the next one, Malacca Strait, you heard about piracy issue, Korean Peninsula, the flashpoint between North Korea, South Korea, China, and Japan, and also including hybrid threats. So that's why Ambassador just mentioned that Indo-Pacific states increased their military budget, right? In the last 10 years, the military budget was sharing of the world was just below 20%, but now it's over 28% share of the world in the part of Indo-Pacific states. And then the third challenges is normative challenges. Why is that? Because democracy and human rights in this EU Indo-Pacific strategy, right? In Indo-Pacific, it's very challenging. You have over 40 states, and you have so diverse kinds of governance, from utmost authoritarian regime like North Korea to illiberal democracy, maybe like us in the past. So in terms of political system are different. In terms of norm, there were the clashes that we always debate on both Asian way and Western way of human rights relativism and human rights universalism. Human rights relativism always used by China or Myanmar Tatmadaw to control their citizens, while the US, the EU also always raise the United Nations Covenant on Human Rights. So this is a kind of ideas clashing. And then the fourth point, the challenges in terms of environmental, climate change, the biodiversity challenges. There's a crisis in marine biodiversity, and also the ratio of carbon emission in Indo-Pacific states increased in the last 20 years. So now the share of carbon emission of Indo-Pacific region is over half of the world, is 57% of the world carbon emission. So this is quite a challenging area indeed. And what is exactly EU strategy in Indo-Pacific? Well, the EU focus on the 7 special areas. And I think it's the areas that sometimes, like ambassadors say, is overlapped with our EU and ASEAN strategic partnerships as well. Because it's areas that rule-based and comprehensive, right? And ASEAN is EU like-minded partners, right? The word like-minded is not just my own expression, and ambassador just say like-minded. It's listed out in the official EU paper. So 7 areas in Indo-Pacific is sustainable and inclusive prosperity. The second one is digital economy. The third one is green transition, in which EU focus a lot. The fourth one is ocean governance. The fifth one is connectivities, and then security and human securities. If I have to pick what issues or initiatives that ASEAN could fit in the first top 3, I would pick firstly, like both ambassadors say, Ambassador Daly and Ambassador Driesman, about connectivities that the ASEAN-EU Comprehensive Air Transport Agreement is the world's first block-to-block air transport agreement. And it's not just only the agreement to facilitate this kind of business, but it needs to respect fair trade, financial transparency as well. It's very norm-based. And then the second issue is the green transition. ASEAN now try to develop smart and green ASEAN cities or SGAC, and then the digital economy in which ASEAN now have ASEAN Digital Index and Master Plan. So it seems that the cooperation of the EU Indo-Pacific region and the like-minded partners seems going well. But as an academic, I must show some constraints in this EU Indo-Pacific strategy as well. There will be three constraints I can think of. And the first constraint is that it's a normative again and highly involved with China, right? So taking EU-China relations and the situation of human rights violation in Uyghur Xinjiang province, the comprehensive agreement on investment between EU and China a negotiation was suspended. And because of this human rights violation in Xinjiang was highly escalated. And then there is a kind of sanction from the EU to China, and also China retaliated back to the EU since 2021. So this is the first constraint that I see. And then the second constraint is internal constraints, right? The internal constraints from the EU. Well, the EU is not only Brussels, there's member states. And taking the China case again, it is undeniable that why the EU tried to push for normative pressure to China, there are several member states who has a close relations with China and want the EU to restart the negotiation of the CAI, or the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment again with China. So this make the ES, or the European External Action Service work become more difficult, because the Team Europe sometimes are hard to deliver with one voice as well in the issues of China. And then the last one, external constraints. The external constraints could involve regionalism, like how the EU going to engage with ASEAN, how ASEAN will keep an eye shut on human rights, on Rohingya, or on the issue that maybe other panelists will raise, or the external partner as a member states like China and Myanmar. So I finished outlining these two overlapping geopolitical spheres. And I'd like to point out that EU-ASEAN and EU-Indo-Pacific, they share things in common. And that common is the anxiety on China under the US-China rivalry global structure. And when coming to approach of how China hedge with, how ASEAN state hedge with China, is so different. You have just an extreme case of Myanmar Tatmadaw that just go out of this US and China structure. They just side with Russia because US sanctioned them and China kept silent, so they just fully support Russia operation in Ukraine. So apart from, I already list out why ASEAN is important for the EU, I would like to end with what the EU can do for ASEAN as well. The first thing is that, as maybe Ajahn Popisut touched lightly, that EU could become a policy choice of ASEAN strategic autonomy of this US-China structure. And the second, EU could already provide financial aid and expertise of economic integration to ASEAN, especially under ASEAN community and ASEAN economic community. Even though Brussels relying on maybe community methods, supranationalist model of integration, which is quite different. But the EU is very pragmatic, especially in the Arise Plus money, by allowing ASEAN to continue to conduct their sovereignty-based integration. And with, under the bracket again, that with rule-based, right, the EU encouraged that, okay, you must protect intellectual property rights, you must protect environmental, and you must pursue just and fair trade. So I would leave it here, and then I will continue for the second round. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajahn Natanan, for outlining the benefit, common interest between ASEAN and EU in the Indo-Pacific strategies. So now, if you actually look at the same survey that I have mentioned earlier, if you look at the Thailand specific case, in that surveys, it ranks quite high. I mean, in terms of like the Thai respondents' attitude toward the EU, right? I mean, especially in terms of a free trade agenda, the Thai policymakers and stakeholders thinks the EU's upholding the free trade agendas and we should promote the Thai-EU relations, and especially like the last point that Ajahn Natanan was touching is about strategic choice. 42% of the Thai respondents also mentioned that EU is our choice for that foreign policy option. So we can sort of see that Thailand look up at the EU as a strong partners in many areas, from economics to geopolitics, right? During the commemorative summit in Brussels, we also signed another separate bilateral agreement, the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, PCA. Certainly, it brings the bilateral ties between Thailand and the EU at the new level, right? It emphasizes circular economy, collaborations for peace and security in Indo-Pacific. So Thailand is a strong supporter of the EU in ASEAN, so to speak. So, however, the public may not realize this kind of importance between, of the EU, for Thailand, and because the lay public might not be interested so much in foreign affairs, and probably only us, who are in policymakers, academics, think tank would think about that. So now, like, we are lucky to have the policy practitioners from foreign ministry to elucidate, what kind of Thailand's roles, right, in promoting Thailand's EU relations, also in the broader areas like ASEAN-EU relations in general, what actually Thailand wants and what's our interest and the products we have accomplished so far. Please.
Yes. Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank ISIS Thailand and the EU Commission in Bangkok for this opportunity to exchange views with you, share with you some of our thoughts on the ASEAN-EU relations, and welcome Igor, one of my close colleagues in ASEAN circuit, to Bangkok once again. You have heard from Ambassador Drisen on what the EU think of ASEAN, but I would like to give you a perspective from ASEAN why we think that it should be the EU. That might help answer Ajahn Pongpisut's questions on the poll of who should be our best partner under this context, the changing geopolitical landscape. I would like to say that for us, we view the EU as our natural partner. When I say natural partner, it's not something that we can decide and implement something right away, but it has been built upon for centuries. It's built upon the close relations between individual ASEAN member states, EU individual member states, and as a group, both of us are the two most advanced regional groupings in the world, and we have shared common values, regionalism, multilateralism, rules-based order that you have already mentioned. So all of this are the strong foundation for the ASEAN-EU relations. And throughout the past 45 years, it has proven to be a very meaningful relationship. And we are glad that we eventually could enhance our partnership into a strategic partner, and I think EU is well deserved for that strategic partnership. If you look at the relations between ASEAN and EU, Igor mentioned that we have 20 dedicated technical dialogues between ASEAN and the EU. I'd like to show this slide to say that we have all those cooperation cover all three pillars of the ASEAN community. If you look at the political security pillar, the EU is one of the active member in the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is one of the biggest regional platform on strategic dialogues. The EU is also the high contracting party to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia, which is one of the key instruments on security and cooperation in this region. And if you look at the economic pillar, EU is our third largest trading partner and also the largest FDI contributor of ASEAN. And Igor and Ajahn Nathanan also mentioned the signing of the Comprehensive Air Transport Agreement last year, which is a milestone achievement because it's the world's first ever bloc-to-bloc or region-to-region aviation agreement. And if you look at the socio-cultural pillar, we have strong people-to-people ties. We have regular exchanges of education and culture. So it covers all three pillars of the ASEAN community. And when I remember when we start drafting the ASEAN Charter, there was a big debate whether we should follow the EU model of having a supranational organization. And the answer came very clearly that perhaps it's not time for us to follow the EU model, but the EU is our inspiration for greater regional integration. Ajahn Nathanan mentioned about the Indo-Pacific. In the context of the Indo-Pacific, I think it is very important because it's if you look at the geostrategic uncertainties, the area that cover between these two big oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean region, it covers 2/3 of the world economy, and it also home to 7 of the world largest militaries as well. So strategically, it's really important for both of us. And if you look at the Indo-Pacific strategy during the past few years, there are a lot of Indo-Pacific strategies from various countries, and ASEAN was concerned that we would be forced to choose side. Ajahn Nathanan mentioned that geopolitical competition between major power, particularly US, China, Russia, that also have ramification on ASEAN and country in the Indo-Pacific region as well. So what we don't want to see is to have this region, the Southeast Asian region, as the theater of competition that will lead to tension and confrontation. But what we will want to see is to have the cooperation between countries located in these two regions, the Indo-Pacific region, to work together constructively, and we can provide platform for countries both within this region and outside the region to have inclusive cooperation, provide platform that is comfortable to all, that whether you have your own Indo-Pacific strategy or Indo-Pacific initiative or not, you can come to work with us in a constructive manner. And this is what we really appreciate, the EU strategy on the Indo-Pacific, because the word inclusiveness is also mentioned in that strategy. And the reference to ASEAN centrality is also there. So we look forward to working closely with the EU. From our part, we have the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which was adopted during Thailand Chairmanship of ASEAN back in 2019. And our idea is to provide platform for constructive dialogue, constructive cooperation based on the principle of the 3 M's, which is mutual trust, mutual respect, and mutual interest. So this is our idea of having the Indo-Pacific outlook I think my Deputy Prime Minister always mentioned that it's its own ASEAN vista of how ASEAN can provide a platform for dialogue and cooperation and bring our partners, because if you mention the US, Russia, China, the EU, they are all dialogue partners of ASEAN, which has helped contribute to regional development, advancement of our people. So it will be a good opportunity for ASEAN to provide such platform for dialogue and cooperation instead of choosing side and risking making this region a theater of competition, confrontation, and bring tension to our region. So we hope to see the constructive role of the EU in this context. And if you, I mentioned about constructive cooperation between ASEAN and the EU, perhaps I can offer you some of my thoughts on how what we would like to see the EU play a constructive role in this region. And first is to address, we would like to see the EU help address geopolitical volatility and security challenges. Igor already mentioned this, your interest in participating in the ADMM Plus expert working group is appreciated. And Thailand, you know us very well. We have been pushing very hard for the EU to be able to take part in the ADMM Plus EWG. And while the decision deliberation is ongoing, we think that the EU doesn't have to wait for that. You can participate in various platforms that you are already members. The ARF is one of them. And under the ASEAN-EU dialogue relations, you can also have constructive role in contributing to regional peace and security. The issue, as I mentioned, the cooperation under the Indo-Pacific framework will be another area that EU can play a constructive role in this region. Second is the issue of green transition towards sustainability. Both Ambassador Igor and Ajahn Nathanan also mentioned this issue, and I think this is one of the key takeaways from the ASEAN-EU Commemorative Summit in December. The green partnership between the ASEAN and EU will be one of a good example that we as a regional grouping can work together and contribute to the global goods. We appreciate the EU contribution to ASEAN efforts to address the issue of climate change and attain the ASEAN, the Sustainable Development Goals. Igor mentioned the contribution of the EU in setting up the ASEAN Circular Economy Platform in Thailand, and that will be one of the flagship projects that ASEAN and EU can work together towards this goal. And we also appreciate your initiative, the Green Team Europe initiative. That will be another area that we can work together in terms of sustainable development. Another area is economic cooperation. This is really important if you take into account the need for our region to fully recover from the pandemic. And ASEAN itself, we also have the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, and partnership with our external partners is one of the strategic areas that we think will greatly contribute to ASEAN collective efforts to fully recover from the pandemic. During the ASEAN EU Commemorative Summit, my Prime Minister mentioned the issue of standards. We think that the EU, which is highly recognized for their standards, both in terms of labor standard, environmental standards, industrial standards. Your expertise on this can help contribute to ASEAN efforts in trying to catch up with the international standard. And if we can work on that, ASEAN can become an integral part in the supply chain, the global supply chain. And I think that will be for the mutual benefit of both ASEAN and the EU. Because if you look at some options in the future to help ensure supply chain sustainability, if ASEAN can enhance our standard and can get some assistance from the EU in improving our capacity, we can also contribute back to the EU as well. And I think that will be a good foundation for our future FTA, both Thailand EU FTA and the ASEAN EU FTA, because in order to conclude the various FTAs, you need to reach certain standards, and capacity building on this will be really critical. And I would like to conclude by mentioning that both ASEAN and the EU, as the two most advanced regional groupings, if we work together, we can help contribute to the global efforts in addressing global issues, issue of climate change. We could help other countries in attaining the sustainable development goals. We could also contribute to building a peaceful environment in this region and beyond, and that is very crucial for our collective efforts in recovery fully from in the post-COVID era. So I would like to end with that. Perhaps I would like to hear more from Ajahn Pinipan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director General Usana. You can see like what she has been trying to convey the message to us is that EU's could be one of the great partner to Thailand foreign policies and our general policies that we have been promoting, right? Like a lot of keywords that Director Usana was like mentioning about the green economy, connectivities, economic cooperations. Thai government has been trying to promote these issues for quite some time. So if you look at the APEC summit, couple of months ago, you can see this also echo, constantly in Thai government's policy. So EU would be like a good partner for cooperations and improving these kind of development in the countries. And these, the optimistic attitudes that we share, between ASEAN and EU as well as Thailand and EU cooperations, and that's important, right? Optimism is very important. It opens to more possibilities for cooperations and mutual respect, and ability to overcome challenges in the futures. But needless to say, but the fact that despite all these efforts, right, we have to recognize one of the mere fact that EU and ASEAN are quite different in many ways. Firstly, we are geographically apart. We share different cultures, interests and norms, and that could be some obstacles that could 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 pop up in the futures, among all the member states between ASEAN and EU when we try to implement and agree on a lot of things. So I remember like back in the 90s, when EU and ASEAN and East Asian countries trying to launch the ASEAN, right, the meeting, and the Myanmar issue becomes one of the stumbling block, of the cooperations, and like how many years ago from the 90s until now, we still have Myanmar issues, coming as one of the challenge to our cooperations, right? Like it's here. So since like I was in undergrad in the 90s, so we can see like we still have a lot obstacles and challenges altogether to overcome, right? So that show some of the challenges that we have to tackle, right? And then Dr. Pinitpan is gonna touch upon these kind of challenges, obstacles, between EU and ASEAN, and how we can overcome these if possible. Please, Dr. Pinitpan.
Hello. สวัสดีครับ Thank you so much ครับอาจารย์ and it's my very pleasure and honor to be here, and this is my first time joining ISIS Thailand forum as panelist. I do very optimistic about the relationship, despite the fact that there are so many challenges ahead, lies ahead. But why I'm trying to prepare and exchange my view with all of you is to come back to a very simple question about who we are. Who are we as it called ASEAN, and what do we need, and trying to stand the relationship from that perspective. So I trying to look at the relationship right now and beyond from a very basic Southeast Asian perspective, so that we can build up mutual understanding about what we are expecting to see the collaboration in the next few years or few decades. I think so far we have learned all about such unprecedented occasion, right? That EU-ASEAN summit brought about to the audiences from both regions. It was timely, I would say, as we are now re-emerging from COVID-19 pandemics, and it was really ripened as it comes about during the most critical geopolitical tension stretching from Russia and Ukraine to the South China Sea and the rise of China. This is also the first time ever for that inter-bloc summit that enables institutional commitment to promote the enhanced engagement and to achieve some of key areas of cooperation. While ASEAN is located within the EU's plan for post-pandemic inclusive socio-economic recovery, the relationship with the EU will be of strategically significant for ASEAN as well, in addition to other powers, allowing ASEAN to manageably diversify their countries' external relationship. Along the summit, I think a round of discussion includes a very wide range of agendas, and that would basically take the relationship to another level, another step, including very remarkable, the announcement of EU Global Gateway program that would bring together the blocs financial development institutions as well as some other private sector to encourage investment in the region. And as we have seen, common priorities are discussed and well set with explicit recognition of ASEAN centrality. That's the most important for people like me studying ASEAN, and the existence of ASEAN institution in that regard. While unfolding geopolitical tension prevails, I think strategic opportunities may arise from both sides. And indeed, I think turbulent Indo-Pacific would bring about the closest ever relation between the EU and ASEAN. But to answer the question, what lies ahead after EU-ASEAN at 45, I think there are two basic questions as academia. How can we make sense of the current strategic endeavors of ASEAN? And secondly, how has Southeast Asia or ASEAN actualized its agency to be able to cultivate their strategic position vis-a-vis the EU? So this question, I think, will navigate our understanding of the realization of such unprecedented meeting and visionary planning. I would argue that the realization of these common interests cannot be achieved without the understanding of ASEAN strategic thinking, identity, as well as domestic conditions which play such a significant role these days. So my presentation would be twofold. First is about ASEAN perception towards the Indo-Pacific region that share some thoughts with its EU counterpart. And second, we'll highlight some of the key concerns that might undermine the realization of the plan. And I try to stick to 15 minutes presentation, Kapatan. So I think, just back to basic. While the EU Council adopted conclusion on the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific in 2021, the idea of free and open Indo-Pacific was proposed in 2019 in Bangkok, right here, during ASEAN Summit. And it is, I think, worthwhile to look back and see how ASEAN has evolved around the term of reference, the so-called Indo-Pacific. The regional grouping released its official ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, or AOIP, adding another definition to the terms into the global discourses of Indo-Pacific. While emphasizing its strategic roles, ASEAN maintains that the region of Indo-Pacific is a region for dialogue, cooperation, development, and prosperity for all. I would argue that AOIP was then to promote inclusiveness among galvanizing forces toward constructive cooperation with and through ASEAN based on the principle of mutual trust, mutual respect, and mutual benefit. That said, the document intends to actualize ASEAN as an honest broker within the strategic environment of competing interests, which already mentioned by other panelists. It also intends to enhance ASEAN community building process and to strengthen and give new momentum for existing ASEAN-led mechanisms. ASEAN centrality is therefore deemed essential according to the long-standing norms of process-driven approach to coordination and collaboration in safeguarding an inclusive Indo-Pacific regional architecture for all. So even though, AOIP was disappointed by many who argue that it would not and could not offer anything beyond an irresponsive or ineffective ASEAN way. It is worthwhile considering the path ASEAN chose to take for its roles and at this critical juncture, and more importantly, the substance and the idea of it in relation to evolving great power rivalries, including the EU, should be taken into account to our consideration. So I think there are two, aspects that ASEAN and EU share some thoughts when it comes to the idea of Indo-Pacific. And I think this is one of the strong foundations of both parts build up their collaboration. First, Southeast Asia has undergone two intrinsic yet challenging structural transformations to retain U.S. strategic involvement and, importantly, to accommodate, incorporate China's expanding economic, military, and political power more favorably to suit region needs. The AOIP is another form of how Southeast Asia will continue trying to navigate and carefully maneuver the emerging great power rivalries, and that need to be carefully noted. This is what ASEAN has been doing since its foundation. The emphasis of the term without free, perhaps, might be to make sure and to avoid that this is not in some ways include anti-China by any chance, while recognizing the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and some other related principles like freedom of navigation might also be good enough to keep engaging with our old allies like the US. Along with the West's concern on China's growing influence in the region, I think AOIP maintains continued cooperation with China as a way to push Beijing to adhere to internationally accepted standard and form of behaviors. This idea, I would argue, was very well noted in the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. And just recently was laid out explicitly also by the article written by German Chancellor in Foreign Affairs magazines about a couple of weeks ago. Second, while the common conceptualization of ASEAN centrality is associated with institutional practicality of convening, the lengthy discussion of ASEAN centrality in that specific document very much provide a fundamental understanding of the regional self-construction, especially in the time of evolving Indo-Pacific narratives. The conceptualization of centrality does not only stipulate a relevance of institutional processes and mechanisms made and facilitated by ASEAN amidst major power contestation, but the very nature, I would say, of how ASEAN sees itself and how to make itself relevant to the world stage at large. Hence, AOIP gives specific attention to the value of collaboration and dialogues in the region of Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean, experiencing geopolitical geostrategy shift. It prioritizes maritime cooperation, connectivity, so on and so forth, with ASEAN playing a central role in which I would argue the EU Indo-Pacific strategy also highlights. So I think all in all, a strong and long-standing relationship between the EU and ASEAN have already evolved into the degree where they share such a large extent of strategic thinking. It is fair to argue at this point that the EU-ASEAN Summit and its output visualize a mutual strategic direction in key areas of cooperation in tackling with unfolding tensions among the major powers and also uncertainty posted by them. On that note, really, we can be very optimistic that this will pave the way for another level of collaboration between the two blocs. Anyhow, perhaps a very daunting task has still been about how to cope with. I find a hard time picking a right word to explain this. I don't like the terms like problems, challenges, but I call it as discrepancies of expectations because there are so many good things between the two. Problem may arise somewhat, but we still have some gaps in our expectation to get things done. And I think there are 4 aspects of gaps that I would like to lay out to all of you. First of all, expectation on how ASEAN handle with Myanmar crisis, obviously. On the one hand, EU will continue to support ASEAN effort to facilitate a peaceful solution through existing 5-point consensus, which is a brilliant idea because we live in ASEAN and I think this is our responsibility, even though it's failed. In a way, such recognition enhances ASEAN roles as a very legitimate regional grouping that has full potential to deal with its own problem. But still, the failure in realization of the consensus for over a year now definitely caused, I would call it institutional stress of ASEAN centrality that would prevent EU-ASEAN relationship to be materialized in the future. While the situation in Myanmar is threatening to derail every higher level meetings within ASEAN fellows and between ASEAN and its counterpart, the EU included, the crisis would make the EU members divided between those who are really don't want to get mingled with Myanmar and those who have or favor less hard-line stance, such as the southern part of the European continent. Second, ASEAN countries, despite their power limitation, enables its inclusive regionalism through its extensive institutional processes designed to absorb uncertain power impulses. Meanwhile, it allows diplomatic practicality among member states to become a part of the very nature of international order, which is contingent upon the dynamics of the local agency, meaning dynamics of the local politics within ASEAN towards major powers, and the availability of weaker powers' profit optimization agendas. So I would say that in recent decades, it has become very clear that Southeast Asian relations with external powers will unfortunately become transactional, pragmatic, and very short term. ASEAN members then share different share of profits across major powers offers. While the EU has been pushing for common front against Russia, ASEAN country has been divided in their response, including Thailand as well. There are numbers of divisions and gaps among ASEAN fellows when it comes to the rights of China, right? We can divide by looking at how maritime states or mainland states in Southeast Asia react differently to China. Because of what? Because we totally have a different profit agenda and transactional kind of nature within the relationship with China. So it's become very clear just recently during President Marcos visited to China, and the manifestation, I would say, of the Philippines in South China Sea will tend to be upon transactional and nature of the relationship. So he changed the position quite a bit from urging, the application of 2016 ruling by the International Tribunal Court at The Hague by emphasizing on the communication channels and mutual mechanisms with the Philippines and China. So my third point would be about the way in which ASEAN can adopt its hedging behavior. And this is very important because of how importance of the terms and ideas of Indo-Pacific. There's so much option for ASEAN to pick from. There's so much availability for the local, for the ASEAN to pick from. The US, China, India, Japan, South Korea, the EU included. So one way or another, EU has become one of the choice, unfortunately. So that's the thing that we need to work on, how to solidify, how to strengthen the collaboration between the two. Because there are so many things between the two, but we still think of someone else. That's kind of relationship. So maybe this is the thing that we need to work on. Lastly, the implementation of the EU vision on the rule-based international order will be definitely hinged on, if not held hostage, by actual politics on the ground. The EU agendas of advancing norms, particularly human rights, development, and environmental standards, so on and so forth, appear to be, even though it's achieved remarkable visibility amongst, Southeast Asian elites and the media and civil society. But things happen, conflict happens. For example, in Indonesia and Malaysia about the biofuel imports, human rights problems in Cambodia, human rights obligation in the Philippines, human trafficking in Thailand. These bring a very fundamental drive for misperception, misunderstanding, and there is a huge gap for both of us to come across and to solve. So I think I end my presentation with a quote that I got from President Mitchell and also President Widodo, if I'm not wrong, during the opening ceremony of the ASEAN-EU Summit. President Mitchell, as I highlight, state that we understand each other very well. We share the same values and the same spirit of collaboration. Widodo speak about, very frankly speaking, I would say, as I highlight, the partnership must be based on equality. So judging from just small tips of, ideas and the language used in the collaboration in the meeting, so there might be some gaps that both sides need to work on, and that gap doesn't have to be, we're asking the EU to come in and help giving assistance, but we need to work on to do stuff together. There's so many things ASEAN need to improve, such as Myanmar crisis, and there are so many things that the EU need to understand Southeast Asia as well. So perhaps we need to learn how to agree to disagree at the moment, but with some sort of clear direction of how we can improve ourselves and the relationship. So thank you very much, Captain.
Thank you, Ajahn Pitipan. So when your last point that you mentioned was about the flexibilities that ASEAN member countries could pursue some interest in the transactional basis, right? That on the one hand, that reflects how ASEAN works, right? Like ASEAN intramural norms of the non-interference principles and respect each other's sovereignties, and that give each country's flexibilities. But on the other hand, that could also affect ASEAN unity in responding to many challenges that we need as a group, right? That unity to tackle, especially when we want to deal with the foreign counterpart in group, and especially like with EU, of course, like there would be some concerns, some incompatibilities, discrepancies that you would prefer. So we have a lot of things to work on among ASEAN themselves, as how we can have like the unity to implement those cooperative agreement and programs that we have been agreeing with the EU. But then we can have discussions on that during the Q&A, and that would be very interesting questions about ASEAN norms, the EU norms, if it's compatible or not. But before we go to that part, let me give not more than 5 minutes to each speakers to sort of wrap up some issues that you want to say at this forum. Starting with the ambassador.
Very briefly, maybe so we can listen to the audience. I think I was struck with the convergence of views on this podium in terms of the kind of clear, positive trajectory of the relationship. Convergence also on the kind of topics that we see as having most potential. Indo-Pacific economic recovery, green transition, and so on. So I think the word optimism was mentioned quite a few times. And of course, there are discrepancies. That is clear, but I think the kind of strength and maturity of the relationship is how you manage them. And I think we manage our discrepancies increasingly well. One thing I might mention is that at the summit, we had a very interesting youth forum. Actually, the youth forum lasted for an entire year, and at the summit itself, they were able to project a few messages to the leaders. If you're talking about the kind of fundamental discrepancies that you highlighted, I think that's where part of our efforts should be.
Thank you very much. Dr. Nathanan first.
Here? Okay. I would end with what is promising areas and what is problematic areas between EU and ASEAN ties. And as ambassador and also the Director General said that we quite agree that the promising areas between EU and ASEAN partnership is mainly in the economic domains, especially the connectivities, green transition, sustainable growth. And I would like to point out that when focusing on these economic domains, doesn't mean that the EU is like economic realist or non-relaxation, because what the EU did for a long time, the EU did with a norm-based. For example, in the case of the reduction of IUU fishing or illegal fishing with Thailand, and these are spreading to be the ASEAN norm, because now ASEAN was talking about having their own common fishery policies, might not be that committed like the EU, but at least it's like a stepping stone for them. So what this economic domain is important, because the EU focus is not only trade itself, but it's trade related, fair trade, and it corresponds to the liberty norm of the EU. And for the problematic domains that I could think of course, we mentioned about the Myanmar questions a lot. And in these 45 years EU-ASEAN relations, there are both ebbs and flows. And well, it's becoming more flows after 2000, but we cannot deny that this human rights Myanmar stumbling block coming again. And even in 2014 and 2015, the relations between the EU and Myanmar has been restored, the delegation re-established again. But there's another issue of the accusation of Rohingya genocide in the Rakhine state. So the sanction coming back, and then the coup in the early of 2021. So this is quite worried me because not only the EU and Myanmar norms was clash, but ASEAN voice is also split. You know that there was hardliner who wanted sanctions, like the EU, for example, Indonesia, Malaysia, and you have a softliner like us, Cambodia and Thailand, who want to compromise with the Tatmadaw. So this is an issue that is quite problematic might be a stumbling block in the EU-ASEAN relationships.
Much, Director General Usman.
Yes, thank you. I would like to point out that during the past few years, when the world is facing with multidimensional challenges, be they the pandemics, climate change, strategic competition, even wars in various parts of the world, these are the time when both ASEAN and EU also realize that our partnership is even more meaningful and crucial for both of us because, as I mentioned earlier, as a bloc, we could contribute not only to the advancement, development of one another, but we, as the two most advanced regional groupings, can contribute to the world at large as well. And the fact that the ASEAN-EU Commemorative Summit could produce a lot of tangible outcomes amidst the geostrategic uncertainties. At first, we were worried. I have to admit to you, Igor, that at first we were worried that the summit will be overshadowed by the situation in Ukraine, the issue of Myanmar. But the fact that both ASEAN and the EU could overcome what Ajahn Pinipan mentioned, the discrepancy of expectation, and can produce tangible outcome from the summit, concrete outcomes, the green partnership, the issue of economic cooperation, the conclusion of the Qatar agreement. All these are testimony to the long-standing relationship between ASEAN and EU, both as a group and as individual member states. And with that, I totally believe that even though there are some challenges that we need to address together, there are some expectation gaps that we need to bridge that. But there are, going forward, we have a lot of future shared prosperity that we can look up to, and we as an implementing agency, we will work closely with the EU, both your mission here and your mission in Jakarta, to help ensure that the expectation of our people, the commitment of our leaders will be concretized and will produce meaningful outcome from this relationship. Thank you.
And Pinipan, don't have any. Oh, yeah. Okay. So both of you were touched upon like some of the important issues. Ambassador Drisman was talking about like building the trust and mutual interest based on people to people exchange and contact. That would be very interesting dimensions that ASEAN and EU could work together, and that would be like becoming the change in the futures that our incompatibilities between the groups intramural norms could lessen in the near futures. And the Ukraine issue is also important, right? I mean, like one of my questions about like ASEAN and EU is that like what if like in the futures the war in Ukraine still unfold, right? I mean, like it's like escalated, and in the futures, would ASEAN become less prioritized in the EU, priorities and commitments, in the futures? That would be one of the issues that I think a lot of us are concerned, in the future of EU and ASEAN, because like both of us are geographically quite far. And that could affect the priorities of the EU's. That perhaps like Ambassador Drisman could start with that questions. If I would throw these questions to you, how EU would be committed to ASEAN.
Well, I think we gave the answer when we met the 15th of December. I mean, it's difficult to give a more clear sign of commitment to the relationship than by gathering all of our leaders for a full day summit and producing the kind of substance Susanna has been talking about. But the second point, of course, is that we believe that the kind of issues that are at stake in Ukraine, the Russian aggression, is an issue for the entire world. The kind of violation that we see to the UN Charter, the kind of violation that we see to territorial integrity is not just an issue for Europe or for the European continent, but an issue that should be tackled and condemned globally. So I think countries in the region are very aware of challenges to territorial integrity. All the more reason to also on Ukraine to speak up.
One of the questions out of these Ukraine issues, actually, we see like in the beginning of the war, and we are trying to have the UN resolutions against the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and some ASEAN countries was like voting not in group, right? I mean, like we have different vote, different opinions, and when we look at the ASEAN EU commemorative summit, we emphasize a lot about like rule-based order, right? We talk about rule-based order, but what kind of rule-based orders that we are talking about? Like the liberal ones that the EU perhaps attached to, or like in the global south, including ASEAN and Southeast Asia, the Westphalian kind of like a rule-based order that a lot of countries still stick to it. That kind of things. That are we on the same page? Do you see any narrow gap between these rule-based order in different meanings, among EU and ASEAN members?
Well, but you are an academic. I am not. For us, rules-based international order is first and foremost the respect for international law. It's as simple as that. So that goes from the ruling that opposed to China and the Philippines on UNCLOS, which was mentioned, or the respect for international law on the European continent, and the kind of flagrant violation day in, day out, even yesterday. It can't be more clear than that we're in a flagrant breach of of any international law imaginable. So I think there's definitely a common basis when it comes to the interpretation of what the rules-based international order is, for sure.
Okay, so perhaps I should open the floor to the audiences. If you have any questions to ask our panelists, please raise your hand, and our staff are going to bring the microphone to you. Any questions? So back to the rule-based order. So let me continue that conversation, right? I mean, like you say, like we share a lot of common interests, right? But then, of course, like basic principle, sovereignties, international laws. But how about like other norms, like liberal norms, like democracies, human rights? You see, like a lot of countries in this region still, the state itself violate human rights and democracies and people's rights. And how would EU compromise, that kind of norms with the practice in Southeast Asia?
Yeah. I think the EU should not compromise their normative basis because, it's the right thing to do. But I think the problem is how the norm is transferred to the receiving countries. For example, we know that democracy originated from European continents. We know that human rights, the anti-fascism or anti-extreme right coming from the brutality of the Holocaust from the Second World War. It is all coming from Europe. But the way that the EU export the norm, and I believe that the European Commission knows is that since Federica Mogherini is that, how to export the norm and not let the receiving or recipient country think that it's a Europe-grown norm, but it relies on United Nations, relies on universal or international law documents. So I think that would help. Yeah.
So from the Thai Foreign Ministry perspective, how have you come up with these obstacles, like when you deal with the EU in negotiations? When the EU raised, of course, like during the coup government in 2014 onwards in 2019, that would be like one of the problems, right, of the EU-Thailand relations. What will you have like in mind?
Yes, I think I share the views of with Ajahn Nathanan that we didn't expect EU to lower your standard. I mentioned earlier that it will be useful. And Ajahn Pininan also mentioned that there's some gaps between the standards that the EU expects us to meet and the capacity in this region to implement those standards. That's not only the issue of human rights, but it's labor standard, environmental standards, and the EU can help us with that. Ajahn Nathanan mentioned about the IUU issue. We were during our chairmanship, we already have problem with the EU on the IUU regarding the IUU issues, but instead of telling the EU to stop, imposing the best practices in the ocean governance to us, but we try to have dialogue with the EU, learn from the EU experience. The EU helped us sharing that best practices, and eventually we not only improve our own standard, but we can share with other ASEAN member states that it's good for all of us it's not to please the EU, but it's good for all of us to better manage our marine environment. So I think this is what we have done, and we are trying to do more. It's you mentioned about the problem when we had a coup, and at that time we also served as the ASEAN EU dialogue coordinator, and it proved that we have our own problem. We are trying to solve our own problem, but at the same time, EU gave us some space to adapt to a better standard, to improve ourselves, to enhance our capacity. And I think if we work together with that mindset, because it's not, when you mention about standard or rule-based order, the rules and the values that each country have, apart from the international law and the values that is universal values. There are some values that each country have uphold differently, and that's as it was a result of a very complex situation, the historical background, social structure, and all those things. So if we try to identify those gaps, work together to bridge those gaps, eventually the values and the standard that you mentioned about can be more attainable in this part of the world. And we have seen some success story of that. And I think if we work on that, it will have addressed the issue that Ajahn Pinitpan mentioned, the discrepancy of expectation.
If you would relate these issues of norms and perhaps Myanmar issues, that could be like stumbling block in the future.
It's also a very difficult question, but I think from European perspectives and actually we as a human being should not compromise the values of human rights and democracies and things like that. And ASEAN need to strengthen that kind of thinking too. But when it comes to actual politics, that can be counterproductive in Southeast Asia. If you regard Southeast Asia in the past decades, civil society is so vibrant and turned confrontational with states. And the state, the regimes, civil society, there are all kinds of battles across Southeast Asia. And when it comes to value-driven kind of collaboration given by the EU, that's very tricky. They'll become eventually very sensitive. So I think what EU can do, and as well as the Southeast Asian government can do, is to open the channel of engagement up to all kinds of stakeholders, and how EU can reach both the states and society at the same time, at the same forum, just basically to avoid the locals to battle against each other with value kind of with norms and the concept of democracies and things like that. So taking Thailand as a case study, that we just signed a PCA agreement, and we are hoping to have bilateral FTA with EU in the near future, which is really challenging. And if you go back to our constitution, Article 178, that allows all kind of public participation in the process of the negotiation. So that's become very tricky and deadly, because all stakeholders are allowed to come in, not at the negotiation stage with the EU, but the parliamentarian through the parliament, to the parliamentarian channels and things like that. So this is the obligation for the EU and Thai government and ASEAN government too, how to collaborate and bring all those stakeholders to come in and understand the same page, and perhaps can have mutual compensation along the way. What can be done, what cannot be done, and the timelines that you need to do it. This kind of question need to be frankly discussed for whole stakeholders, I think.
About the PCA agreement that we just signed, and that and the FTA that we have been on negotiation for, like, how long has it been? Like, it's 10 years. It's 2013 that we started the negotiation process. And from the MFA perspective, what was actually the main obstacle of the FTA with the EU?
As for the PCA, I think it took us 18 years to complete the PCA. But as for Thailand and EU FTA, my Prime Minister briefly had discussion with the EU side during the ASEAN EU Business Forum, ASEAN EU Business Summit. And he sat next to Mr. Dombrovsky, and he mentioned about the possibility of Thai-EU FTA, and he received some recommendations or advice from Dombrovsky that there are some issues that the EU are looking at. For example, the issue of labor standard, the issue of intellectual property rights, services sector, and if we can address all these issues, that will help advance the Thai-EU FTA negotiation, and that will be another building block for the ASEAN-EU FTA as a whole.
Okay, do you
So
have any-
I don't know how long will that take, but
especially like
but-
when the general elections is coming, hopefully in the coming months, that could probably push to the new administration.
Yes, but I think the commitment is there. So no matter who is going to be the next government, I think the efforts to work towards Thai-EU FTA and the support of ASEAN-EU FTA will be there.
Any questions from the audiences? Please, Mr. Daly.
I'm sorry to take the floor again in a way, but I just want to come back on some of the points that have just been made about delays, PCA, FTA, and so on, because I think it's unfair to put these solely on the shoulders of Ambassador Driesmans, who is the ambassador to ASEAN. But as the EU ambassador to Thailand, I think we have to recall that the single most important factor of delay in these agreements has been the coup. After the coup in 2014, the EU froze its political relations with Thailand. Over time, over a number of years, things began to change in Thailand. The military government ceased in its form. There was a constitution, there was election, there was a new government. Different things changed. Now, you can have a debate about the speed of that change, the degree of that change, and so on. However, fact is that the situation changed, and in recognition of that changed situation, and in the hope that that would continue, the EU decided to relax its political freezing of relations. And in that relaxation, starting in 2017, but also moving on ever since, in that that opened the door for coming back to the table of the PCA and coming back to the question of the FTA. So if you're talking about delays and so on, I mean, the single most important factor has been that. Coming back to the PCA, we noted that the time lag between the negotiations that had taken place before the coup and the situation today, the world had changed, and so the agreement needed to be substantially updated, let's say. And as regards the FTA, we are in this discussion, exploratory discussion about how negotiations could be resumed. And while I cannot predict any timeline on that, what I can say is that over recent months, there has been a very important degree of progress made in relation to those exploratory talks. So they are elements simply to bear in mind when putting this question of, why is it taking so long to negotiate an agreement and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please. Can you introduce yourself and...
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm the ambassador of Germany to Thailand, and I think normally when you sit on the panel and there's so many people who could ask questions and they don't, I feel one has to sort of come in. And thank you for the discussion, very enlightening. I have 2 points and 1 question. Point number 1, serving outside of the EU, you realize how really unique it is, the European decision to actually pool sovereignty and to sort of give away sovereign rights of a nation state to a supranational institution. It's very unique, and it's also very controversial, and it will continue, and it's a very interesting experiment that we did out of the disaster of the Second World War caused by the country that I'm here to represent. That's number 1, point number 1. Point number 2, it was mentioned about human rights, and I can just recommend everybody to also familiarize, if you are not familiar with the history of the drafting of the Declaration of the Human Rights, because they are universal. You can see the footprints of Chinese intellectuals who participated in it, and they changed a lot of the words. You can see the footprints of an Indian lady who actually participated in the drafting, and you can see the prints of an Islamic scholar who participated. So I would say, no, these are not Western values. These are universal values that all countries have actually signed up to. And I think it's very important, Bangkok as the seat of SCAP, to put that forward and not to say, oh, it's Western and it's not. I mean, nobody likes to be tortured, for instance. Whether you're Chinese, Brazilian, or German, you don't enjoy being tortured. That's the second point I'm having. And the question I'm having is, when we talk about region integration, the future of ASEAN, we talked a lot, of course, it's an EU-ASEAN seminar. Before coming here, I was Africa director in our foreign ministry, and I think it was very interesting to see regional integration on the African continent. And if you sort of avert your view from EU-ASEAN and take into consideration what's happening in other regions, I'm not familiar with Latin American region integration, but a lot with African, where people have the right to reside in different countries, where they have sometimes even the same currency. Where would you see ASEAN in 10 years if you compare what's happening in those regions? And how important are those regions for you when you evaluate where you want to be in ASEAN? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador Schmidt. I will attempt to compare ASEAN with the ECOWAS, because you used to be work on the African department. ASEAN is a regionalism in Southeast Asian, and ECOWAS is the West African states. I think in terms of economic integration, there one part of ECOWAS that quite promising, in which there is the common currency used among the French colony. And it was held by the EU and France to negotiate this economic integration. However, when I put ASEAN and ECOWAS in the normative perspectives again, as I say that the EU is very successful in the normative pressure in economic domains in ASEAN, especially how the EU pressure Thai fishery business, and we followed the standard, the norms of not using underage labor or not heavily fishing, and it's become widespread ASEAN norms, not only Thailand, but Thailand is a kind of like a spearhead on this. But in terms of political domains, ASEAN is quite the way democracy and human rights that the EU try to embed in ASEAN is quite difficult, as we know. But in the case of ECOWAS, I've seen that the political domains was moderately successful in the way that you have the coup in Mali or other Sahel region, and the EU sanctioned, and ECOWAS also sanctioned their own member state, like not let them join the meeting and do a certain kinds of sanctions. And I think the ECOWAS is quite strong in terms of this peace and security, democracy, establishment norm. So I attempt to answer your questions.
Want to add anything?
When we talk about regional integration in Southeast Asia, we focus on three issues. First, of course, is on connectivity. We need to ensure that we can have accessible to all 10 ASEAN member states. The other one is to have a share values and norms. And when we talk about regional integration, we try to identify what is ASEAN identity, and it's really difficult because it's one of the most diverse region in the world. You have diverse religions, you have diverse ethnic groups. So it's very difficult to identify ASEAN identity. But eventually we think that amidst those diversity, we have some shared commonality, we have some shared commons, shared values and norms that all of us uphold, and those are the issues of sovereignty, the issue of territorial integrity, and all those issues. You mentioned about universal values. Some of those are universal values as well. But when we look at some issues, for example, human rights, yes, of course, we are parties to the Universal Human Rights Declaration, but in implementing it, sometimes you sign the agreement, but you cannot fully implement it until you have the enabling environment to allow you to implement all those agreements. And this is what we are trying to do. And this is what the EU can help us to enhance our capacity. Sometimes you need time and space to enhance our capacity. When we have the ASEAN Charter, we mentioned about the need to have ASEAN human rights body in the region to ensure that this will help promote human rights and enhance our ability in human rights protection as well. But at that time, we only have 5 countries in Southeast Asia who have National Human Rights Commission. So let alone of having a regional human rights body. So we have to work really hard to try to enhance capacity of all 10 member states, trying to close that gaps. And eventually we can have ASEAN Human Rights Declaration. We also have ASEAN Intergovernmental Convention on Human Rights. It may not perfect now, but it's a good milestone for us in advancing human rights agenda in this region. So I think all this takes time. We need time and we need capacity to be able to fulfill all those obligations. And I think if we can work on that, we can deepen our regional integration as well.
Thank you very much. At least what you have mentioned earlier, that at least EU is our inspirations, in building up, closer ASEAN, the ASEAN unity, and the form of these regional integrations. And I think in the future, we're gonna have to develop more and perhaps look at the EU lessons and try to strengthen our ASEAN unities. But because time is running out, and I have one last question for perhaps Ambassador Drisman. It's about Indo-Pacific. We didn't really touch upon this issue so much of the EU. Since the Ukraine war, right? It has been driven EU and the US closer in terms of strategic positions in global politics. And do you think the EU Indo-Pacifics in the near future to come, it's going to be more toward U.S. Sort of like approach that is like more security oriented, militarized sort of approach to the strategy.
We follow our own vision on the Indo-Pacific, our own strategy, the themes that we've set out, the values that we've set out. And yes, that includes a security and military component because we think that's important. One of the new elements of the Indo-Pacific strategy was the idea of common coordinated maritime presence, which we're going to deploy soon in the Indian Ocean. But I think we do that as EU because that is our policy. That is not an equation or a subcontext of a broader US EU strategy, I'd say, and even the US strategy and the EU strategy are different in different points. But frankly, I would disagree with the argument that the Russian aggression in Ukraine has distracted us from the Indo-Pacific. On the contrary, I think we feel that we should double down in this part of the world because here are many friends, many allies. This is where growth is. This is where a lot of the future of the century will be written. So I think we should, as foreign policy, be able to do two things at once.
Thank you very much. So that's come to the end of our conversations today about the EU and ASEAN cooperations. You have listened to our panelists about the cooperative framework between EU and ASEAN, that had just concluded in Brussels last month. And I think like in the futures, we still have a lot to overcome, a lot to work on. At least we have like a strong will, political will, and to push forward for these cooperations to in futures. So let me thank all the panelists today. Give a big applause to them, and I hope you. Thank you to everybody. So I hope like next ISIS EU-ISIS talk would be which is coming like in the next few months. We'll receive your support again next time. Before you leave, please scan the QR code and leave some of the comment and evaluations of our activities today. I think it's in the back of each row of the seat. Thank you very much, everyone.